I've been meaning to get to this story since last week when it broke, as it was so out of the blue, out of left field, took a lot of people by surprise, where we have this headline that says that the Ugandan military chief offers to fight alongside Israel in series of viral posts. General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, Uganda's military chief and son of the country's president, Yoweri Museveni, said in a series of social media posts over the past week that he would support Israel in its war against Iran, including offering Ugandan troops as he called for an end to the conflict while warning against threats to Israel. And what I want to do in this video is explain how this is actually very important and indicative of something huge going on in the Middle East, even though the story seemed completely out of left field and like a sideshow. People were almost laughing at it, like, what is this? You know, with everything the United States and Israel is doing, Uganda is offering to fight alongside Israel if Israel is threatened. But it's really very, very big. Now, before we get into all of that, I just want to remind you quick to, as it says up here, open your hand to the needy, feed hungry families this Passover. Israel is under fire. There are a lot of families with a lot of needs. This week is one of the most expensive weeks for families of the year on the Jewish calendar because of Passover. The festival is coming up in a couple days. The war is still going on. And there's a lot more struggles than usual this year. And a great way that you can contribute to easing some of that burden on the Israeli home front and for these families is to go to Israel365charity.com. Throw a couple nickels in the bucket, and Israel 365 is plugged in with all the right people on the ground to make sure that your charity dollars go to really help the needy in Israel. So let's get back to this Uganda story. This General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, he went on, if you take a look at his tweet here, he says, "We want the war in the Middle East to end now. The world is tired of it, but any talk of destroying or defeating Israel will bring us into the war on the side of Israel." In additional posts, Kainerugaba framed his support in religious terms, writing, "We stand with Israel because we are Christians," adding, "Uganda is the David that was forgotten and neglected by the world. We will defeat the giant Goliath." He also urged Israel to launch a ground invasion of Iran and said Ugandan forces could take part. Responding to criticism of his statements, he wrote that Israel had supported Uganda in earlier decades, saying, quote, "Israel stood with us when we were nobodies in the 80s and 90s. Why wouldn't we defend her now that our GDP is 100 billion, one of the largest in Africa? Israel has maintained military and intelligence ties with Uganda and has trained Ugandan soldiers, including this chief, Kainerugaba. Relations between the two countries were not always close. Obviously, we all know the story of the Entebbe hijacking during the time of dictator Idi Amin. In 1976, an Air France flight was hijacked, and then there was a massive rescue operation that the Israelis launched. Israeli forces carried out a long-range rescue mission on July 3rd, 1976, freeing 106 mostly Israeli hostages. And Yonatan Yoni Netanyahu, brother of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was the only casualty in the operation and was later honored for his bravery. Now look at this. This just is the icing on the cake. So this is a tweet from this military chief. "This is a sneak peek of the Yoni statue that will soon be unveiled at Entebbe International Airport. God bless Uganda and Israel." That's right. They are unveiling a statue of Yoni Netanyahu at the airport in Uganda. Okay. So what is this? What's really going on here? So here in the Allgemeiner, Amin Ayub writes about what is really going on with this alliance with Uganda. Okay. So he first starts out talking about the tweets that I just read to you. And look what it says here. "While some policymakers in Washington and European capitals are quick to dismiss Kainerugaba's rhetoric as mere social media bluster, doing so overlooks a profound geostrategic realignment occurring in the global south. This is not just historical poetry or diplomatic hyperbole. It is the public crystallization of Israel's new Circle of Partners framework, a vital evolution of Jerusalem's traditional defense strategy tailored for an era of multi-front warfare." For decades, the Israeli defense and intelligence establishments relied heavily on the periphery doctrine. This strategy involved cultivating quiet but robust ties with non-Arab states to counterbalance a hostile Arab core. Okay? Today, they're saying today that's different because the Arab core is more allied with Israel. Arab core meaning the Saudis, the Emiratis. And the primary existential threat is the Iranian regime. I would disagree. I think it's really the Turks, but we'll get into that soon. Containing and defeating Tehran's regional ambitions requires strategic depth far beyond the Levant, where Israel is, necessitating modernized periphery doctrine that extends deep into the African content. Okay, let me jump ahead. By cementing ties with Uganda, a Christian majority military heavyweight in East Africa, Israel is effectively anchoring a new southern flank. The strategic utility of this partnership becomes undeniable when looking at a map of Iran's maritime ambitions. Tehran has spent years attempting to weaponize the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, primarily through the funding of Houthi proxies in Yemen, while simultaneously seeking naval footholds in the Horn of Africa. East Africa serves as the geopolitical backdoor to this critical maritime corridor. Furthermore, as the conflict with Iran expands across multiple domains, an allied Uganda offers Israel unparalleled intelligence sharing nodes in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, now, this is important. Equally important is the diplomatic and ideological blow this alliance deals to Tehran. The Iranian regime relies heavily on a manufactured narrative that pits the global South against a supposedly isolated Israel. At a time when international forums are routinely weaponized to turn Israel into a pariah state, unconditional support from a prominent African Union member shatters Iran's diplomatic framing. Okay, so that's important on the diplomatic stage. Okay, let me make sense of all this mumbo jumbo that looks like it might have been written with ChatGPT or whatever. Let me make it clear. Here we go. We have the map of Africa here. Oops, let me put that back in. There we go. The map of Africa. So here is Uganda. Uganda's right here. Uganda. Okay. And we know that Israel has recognized Somaliland, which is up here. But now I want to tell you what else is going on in Uganda. Because Israel's buildup of Uganda, Israel's relations with Uganda go back quite some time. This is an article from 2016, Israelis to build up Uganda. After over 40 years, Israeli experts have been chosen to come back to Uganda to help build the country's infrastructure. Okay, and this is an article from 2016 about these Israeli companies and Israeli experts moving in to help rebuild the infrastructure of Uganda. Okay, this is a pretty serious cooperation between the two countries. But at the same time, this is from last year. Foreign Minister Sa'ar meets with Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And this is a visit that Israeli Foreign Minister, a little less than a year ago, May 2025, made to Ethiopia. During his visit to Ethiopia, Minister of Foreign Affairs Gideon Sa'ar met privately with Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed for over an hour at the presidential palace in Addis Ababa. Foreign Minister Sa'ar also met with Ethiopian Foreign Minister Dr. Gideon Timotheus. At a press conference, Sa'ar addressed the Houthi attacks and the Israeli response. Just yesterday, they launched a missile that struck near our airport. Okay, he talks about how bad the Houthis are. During his meeting, Sa'ar highlighted the shared threat of terrorism faced by both Israel and Ethiopia. He noted that the Al-Shabaab terrorist group, those are jihadists, like ISIS, Al-Qaeda types, which targets Ethiopia, is collaborating with the Houthis, which are supported by Iran. Sa'ar emphasized the long-standing alliance between Israel and Ethiopia. He also spoke with Ethiopian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister about enhancing political, economic, and security ties between Israel and Ethiopia. Okay, so that's last May. And then a few months ago, not even a few months ago, a month ago, 3 days before this war began, and you got to believe that he knew it was starting, the president of Israel, Herzog, visits Ethiopia again. 2 major state visits in the space of a year to Ethiopia. Visiting Ethiopia, Herzog touts Israel's strong relationships across Africa. Okay, look at this. President Isaac Herzog visited Ethiopia on Wednesday, where he met with top officials and touted Israel's ties with the East African nation, amid a push from Jerusalem to build and strengthen relationships with countries across the continent. In Addis Ababa, Herzog told Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed that some in Africa and beyond are trying to undermine Israel's relationships in Africa. Who's trying to undermine them? Looks like Turkey. But our bond is strong, and our shared interests are stronger than any such attempt to undermine them. Our drive to innovate and prosper, very nice. Let's jump down. Israel has been making a major push to expand ties on the continent, and Herzog has been a central but quiet player in that effort. In November, Herzog visited Zambia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is my third visit to Africa and the fourth African nation I have visited as president of the State of Israel. The relationship between our peoples is woven deep into the pages of history and tradition. Very nice. And he says some nice platitudes. And then at the end of this article, it says Israel accepts appointment of first envoy from Somaliland. Somaliland sent their first envoy. Okay, what is going on here? What is going on here? Let's look where Ethiopia is. Here's Ethiopia. Here's Uganda that we talked about at the beginning of this video. Okay, there's Somaliland again. Somaliland, Ethiopia, Uganda. You guys see what's going on here? Well, check this out. This is from a few months ago, December 2025. Kenya receives Spider air defense system worth 3.4 billion KSH, whatever that is, from Israel. This is from an African news outlet. Israel has delivered to Kenya a Spider air defense system to enhance Kenya's airspace security. Israel's building up the air defenses of Kenya. This comes just 5 months after, in July 25, President William Ruto's administration announced that it had negotiated a $26 million loan from Prime Minister Netanyahu's administration, while placing Kenya more firmly within shifting global and regional geopolitical currents. For Israel, strengthening military ties with a key African state enhances its diplomatic footprint on the African continent, reinforcing partnerships that extend beyond trade and agriculture into hard security cooperation. The Spider system significantly upgrades Kenya's air defense architecture, and it talks about how powerful an air defense system this is. This is particularly relevant given Nairobi's central role in regional counterterrorism operations and its leadership in stabilization efforts in the Horn of Africa. Look at that. So what's going on here? Let's go back to the map. This is the Horn of Africa. Okay? We're talking now about Kenya. Here's Kenya. Here's Kenya. Here's Ethiopia. Here's Uganda. Okay, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Somaliland up top here where it says Somalia, but this is actually Somaliland, the top part. And here, Somaliland, this strip here, that is jihadist Muslims, one of the worst places in the world to be a Christian. They murder Christians. And who's in there? The Turks. We'll get to them in a minute. But look at what Israel's doing. Major security alliances and economic alliances with Somaliland, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda. Okay, and it goes on. Let's look at this. This is from a few days before that Herzog visit, right before the war, February 19th, less than 10 days before the war with Iran breaks out. And that's why no one noticed these headlines. You're probably hearing about them for the first time. There was a security summit in Rwanda. Americans and Israelis and participants from across Africa convened in Rwanda yesterday for the Kigali Security Summit, titled, this is the title of the summit, Aligning the United States, Israel, Africa, and the New Middle East. Organizers tell the Times of Israel that the gathering explored ways to position Africa as the next frontier for expanding the strategic depth of the U.S.-Israel partnership, with Rwanda serving as a leading gateway partner. Look at that. Israel has been steadily expanding its ties in sub-Saharan Africa in recent years. The strategic vision presented at the conference as the U.S. providing strategic depth and global leadership, Israel contributing security expertise and innovation capacity, and Rwanda serving as a key African partner and bridge to other countries in Africa. Now, part of what Rwanda, Kenya, and Ethiopia and Uganda have in common is that they are Christian majority nations. Now look back at that map. Look at what we're talking about here. Here's Rwanda, here's Uganda, here's Kenya, here's Ethiopia, here's Somaliland. And Israel is building out a security architecture to counter the Houthis and the Turks who are in here. Let me back up a little bit and talk a little bit more about what this really means. Okay, this is not a series of disconnected headlines. Okay, Uganda makes this dramatic statement about helping Israel. Weapons are sold to Kenya, air defenses. This diplomatic move recognizing Somaliland. This is a pattern. Okay, it's a pattern that's happening here. What you're actually seeing is that Israel is quietly becoming a security anchor in parts of East Africa. This is all part of Israel becoming a regional superpower. If you haven't watched it yet, go over to Israel 365 News YouTube channel, go into the playlist section and watch the 6-part playlist of Israel as a regional superpower. And I explain a lot of this stuff there. But this is not, this isn't like, treaties and alliances. It's not just summit meetings. There's something much, much more real here. Okay, they're sharing technology. They're sharing intelligence. Israel's building the security architecture and equipment for these countries. And these days, with this type of equipment, you don't just buy equipment. It's not like just you buy some guns. When you're buying air defense systems, you're plugging in to an air defense system of the host country. Kenya is facing al-Shabaab, jihadist Muslims. Uganda is facing the same threats. Rwanda for years has worked closely with Israel on surveillance, intelligence, internal security. Ethiopia is dealing with internal conflict and regional pressures. They're getting pressured. The Turks are trying to draw them into their orbit. These are not abstractions. These are not just like strange African nations and who cares what they say. These are governments that wake up every morning and they ask one question: how do we stay in control? How do we fend off the jihadist Muslims who are trying to take over Africa? Throughout the continent of Africa, there is a rivalry going on between Christianity and Islam and jihadist Islam, and the Muslims are, wherever they can, they're persecuting Christians. You see what's going on in Nigeria, which is a 50-50 country, but it's really run by Muslims, and the Muslims are slaughtering Christians there. And the Christian majority nations in Africa see this, and they see what's going on in the world, and they know exactly whose side they want to be on. So Israel has built an entire system and is building out that system around this dynamic, right? So they bring in their military technology, their drones, their surveillance, their air defenses, right? And that's what Kenya just bought. Okay, like I said, they're not just buying equipment, they're buying a system, they're buying an operating system. And when you plug in Israeli air defenses, when you train with Israeli doctrine, or like Somaliland, which will actually have Israeli personnel on the ground there, Israeli bases perhaps, when you rely on Israeli intelligence, right, you're in a different league. You're not just buying their equipment. This now, what I showed you on the map there, this is a whole security ecosystem, a whole group of countries that are adjacent to each other. And that's what Uganda's statement about fighting alongside Israel is really about. It's giving us, it's making something public that was already less public, right? Because they're already inside the Israeli security ecosystem, right? They were just making it public. Now let's zoom out a little bit more, because this is where things get much more interesting. Israel, and I mentioned the Turks a couple times in this video, because Israel is not the only ones who are looking at Africa and trying to build a kind of network, because Turkey's doing the same thing, but they're doing it on the Islamist side. And they're also more aggressive about it. They go right in and they build bases. They train the local armies. And in places like Somalia, and in also Libya, which is also in Africa, Turkey is the dominant security actor, and they're also active in Ethiopia, trying to pull the Ethiopians away from the Israelis. But the Ethiopia is being aligned more and more with Israel, and that's why over this last year we've seen those multiple visits of senior Israeli officials. I mean, the foreign minister, the president, visiting Ethiopia, engaging in those dialogue, getting those deals done, because Ethiopia is critical. When you look at that map and you see how big Ethiopia is and where it's located, Ethiopia is critical to this whole thing. And that's why the Turks are also working so hard to gain control of Ethiopia. Okay. But the Turks, they're like training the Somalia army, and they're deeply embedded there, right? So on one side, you have Turkey entrenched in Somalia. On the other side, you have Israel moving into Somaliland and all the other adjacent countries around Somalia. Right? You see what they're doing. It's obviously a positioning move. Now, when you move further inland from Somalia, you see Ethiopia and Uganda openly aligning with Israel, Kenya with the air defenses, Rwanda deeply tied to Israeli security cooperation. This is not it's not just different alliances. It's a regional alignment. It's a corridor from the Red Sea through the Horn deeper into East Africa. And yeah, so that's what we're seeing here. So the Uganda announcement is again, much, much bigger than it looked. Now, final point about this. For years, Israel's had these relationships in Africa. I showed you that a few of them go back quite a ways, but they were much more quiet and they were much more transactional. You buy some equipment, you get some training, Israel's doing business somewhere. But what's changing now is that there's much more ideological rhetoric behind it. It's much more out in the open, the recognition of Somaliland, the statement by this Ugandan military leader about being Christian and defending Israel. You see it much more overt. And that also solidifies these relationships. Because when the military chief says we would fight alongside Israel, he's obviously not talking about sending groups into Gaza. He's signaling where his alignment is. He's saying we are on that side of the emerging global divide, right? That's what he's signaling, and that's huge, because Turkey is expanding, China is building infrastructure and influence, and you have Russia operating there as well, and now more and more you have Israel bringing in a security network in East Africa. So when you see these headlines about Uganda, Kenya, Somaliland, don't read them as isolated events or something that's happening like, it's sort of a sideshow. They're not a sideshow. These are indicators of something extremely significant. It's not exactly an alliance, but it's a group of states that rely on the same systems, are plugged into the same intelligence networks, and are part of the same strategic partnerships that all are being directed by or quarterbacked, as it were, by Israel, and that's just huge. So again, that's what this is really about. That's what I wanted to tease out in this video about Uganda, about Africa, about what we're actually seeing here. Okay, that's it. That's what I wanted to do in this video. I hope this was interesting. I hope you learned something from it. But again, there's a lot of headlines that get lost as we read the news every day, because the big things are what we notice. But these little things, when you start putting them together, you start adding them up, and you realize what they actually mean. When the dust settles on this war in Iran, there's going to be a realignment of everyone in the Middle East. You're going to see it. And Israel's position is strengthening. And these Africa partnerships that Israel's building out are critical. And also keep in mind that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying over the last year or so that one of Israel's agenda items is to defend the Christians in Africa from the jihadist Muslims who are, Boko Haram and others who are trying to take over and are slaughtering Christians everywhere, these jihadists. So Israel is taking in a more active role, but this also signals that the Houthis now have a much more formidable enemy right near them. And that could be part of the reason why they've stayed out of the war in Iran. We've noticed that they've been talking tough, but they haven't lifted a finger yet. Right now, Israel has a much greater presence right across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait from the Houthis, and maybe that's part of why they're keeping a low profile. So interesting developments. Thanks for watching. Please share, please like, do all that great stuff. I hope you're enjoying the channel. And yeah, it's leading up to Passover preparation, so that's why I'm not in a normal studio. Everything's kind of up in the air. I'm building out a new studio space in this room, so hopefully we're going to have a new look in the coming days.